Thank you to the Norwich Society. It's been a complete, it's been an amazing year. I've met so many people. I've had so much support and encouragement, and I thank you all. My name is Dr Alison Dow. I'm a doctor of medicine and a former senior partner at a GP practice in Mile Cross here in Norwich. I've always loved history. It's kind of in my DNA, I think. Looking at the past helps us understand where we are now. I'm very much an amateur historian, but I do, however, have 2 professors of African history in my immediate family. I don't know if anyone remembers these jackdaw educational literature. I've had this since I was about 10. The Slave Trade and Its Abolition, a collection of contemporary documents compiled and edited by John Langdon Davis. So obviously I was meant to be here today. I'm a child of empire. I was born and brought up in northern Rhodesia, which is now Zambia. I've got vivid memories of Independence Day, the 24th of October, 1964. I had 2 childhood heroes growing up. The first was Dr. Kenneth Kaunda, who was the first president of Zambia. I had the enormous honour and pleasure of having a private dinner with him in 1981 in State House in Lusaka. The second hero growing up was Dr. David Livingstone. I didn't have dinner with him. I didn't meet him. He died in Zambia, and his heart is buried in Chitambo district in Central Province. Zambians have a deep respect for Livingstone. They still feel, and they felt at the time, that he really wanted the best for them. He tried to give practical support to help challenge the economic model behind slavery. And that, on this matter, David Livingstone was deeply inspired by none other than Thomas Fowell Buxton, who he heard speak in London the year before he set off on his first visit to Africa. Today's talk, I'm really going to focus on the story behind this plaque that sits on the wall in a small side chapel of our very own Norwich Cathedral. Remember Thomas Fowell Buxton Bt, Member of Parliament, whose efforts led to the emancipation of 700,000 slaves on 1st of August 1934. 1834, sorry, thank you. Just correct me, yes. At the time of his death in February 1845, Fowell Buxton was one of the most famous English men on earth. Today, he is very much an unsung hero. To his many descendants, of whom there are plenty here today, he is known as the Liberator. His achievements were extraordinary in his lifetime. His work on penal reform helped to reduce the number of crimes punishable by death from 230 to 8. He chaired the first ever meeting of the Society of Prevention of Cruelty to Animals in 1824. He loved the countryside and he planted hundreds of trees. And this is a bizarre one. He rescued the capercaillie, which is an ancient Scottish game bird, from extinction. So there we are. But his outstanding achievement was the Abolition of Slavery Act. Legacy of empire and its slave trade is a very topical current issue. Fowell Buxton's life sits at the heart of this narrative. I'm hoping by looking at his life I can shed some light on current debate. The Parliamentary battle, it was a battle, was brutal and lengthy, and it lasted over 60 years. In 1807, the Act to End the Slave Trade was passed, spearheaded by William Wilberforce MP. In 1833, the Slavery Abolition Act was passed, spearheaded by Thomas Fowell Buxton MP. Slaves were to be freed on the 1st of August 1834, which is why we hear that date talked about more than the 1833 Act. I've put a picture here on the inside of the House of Commons. I think we have all been aware in recent times, even in the last few days, of how adversarial, bruising and toxic this place can be. A highly charged atmosphere existed during all the many debates on slavery. I think the political world of then is pretty similar to today's. The wording on the plaque is dignified and understated, a bit like Fowell Buxton, I suspect. The figure of 700,000 is now generally accepted as nearer 800,000. Other people's efforts counted too. Firstly, we must acknowledge the enslaved, most of whom are nameless. They rattle their chains for hundreds of years. We must also recognise the huge contribution from great swathes of the British public who orchestrated a carefully planned programme of petitions, public meetings, and distribution of literature. It has been said that this was the first ever large-scale human rights campaign. I'm going to talk about Fowell Buxton's life before I go back to the history of the plaque. He was born in 1786 in Castle Hedingham, Essex. His father was also Thomas Fowell Buxton, and he was an Anglican. He was a local landowner who served as the High Sheriff of Essex. His mother, Anna, was the daughter of Osgood Hanbury, a Quaker brewer. Fowell Buxton was baptised in the Church of England. After his father died when he was 6, his Quaker mother became the chief influence in his life. He said of her, "She was large-minded in everything and led me to form and express my opinions without reserve." The family can be traced to Sudbury in Suffolk and to Norfolk. Fowell Buxton's crest, of which he was very proud, was claimed from the Herald's College, the arms that had been borne by the Buxtons of Tiverton. So somehow the Buxtons of Tiverton and Norfolk are involved. Do it with thy might. The second picture is an engraving of the crest, which sits above a fireplace in Runton Old Hall in North Norfolk, which was one of the many Buxton houses. Growing up, Buxton had a pretty unsatisfactory, disjointed education, and it seemed to be destined to a life of country sporting pursuits. Then everything changed. At age 15, he came to Norfolk and stayed with the Quaker Gurney family at Earlham Hall. His mother's sister was married to another Gurney who lived in Norfolk. So there was some family connection, obviously. The visit was to change his life. John Gurney Sr. was a wool merchant whose wife had died when his oldest child, Catherine, was 17. He lived at Earlham Hall, Norwich, with his 11 surviving children, the household being held together by Catherine. The family took the young Tom under their wing, but it was one of the 7 sisters, Hannah, that caught his eye. The third daughter, Elizabeth Fry, was already married to a London banker, Joseph Fry. The father and children led lively lives with lots of drawing and singing and entertaining. It seems that there was a really eclectic array of guests, rich and poor, to the house, with a good mixture of Unitarians, Catholics, Anglicans, and fellow Quakers. Catherine paid careful attention to the education of her siblings, and they read widely, including David Hume and Thomas Paine, which was pretty radical for those days. Tom and Hannah formed a lasting relationship from then onwards. Tom also formed a strong bond of friendship with 2 of the brothers, John Gurney Jr. and Joseph John. Tom left Earlham Hall with a new focus and a new love of reading and learning. He enrolled to study at Trinity College, Dublin, where he graduated with the highest award of the university, the gold medal, thanks to the Gurneys, I think. I want to look at Norwich in 1801. He came here first in 1801, but returned to time and time again. I've got a strong feeling that it was in Norwich that Fowell Buxton's intellectual, political, and liberal passions were awakened. It was certainly in Norwich that he made his first public speech in 1812 at a meeting of the Bible Society. It was in Norfolk that he married, lived, died, and is buried. Norwich in 1801 was a forward-looking city with a large, non-denominational community. The wealth from the wool trade had brought in urbanisation and a rich cultural life, with time for debate and argument, and thus a radicalism emerged. Societies and bookshops and libraries flourished. Norwich was the first provincial town to develop compulsory payments for a civic scheme of poor relief. In 1714, it was the first provincial town to publish its own newspaper outside London. It was the Norwich Post. That's the Friend's house, and that's inside of the Octagon Chapel, which I'll come to next. Quakers were one of the many groups who in the 17th century began to challenge the beliefs and ideas of the Church of England. One of the earliest Quaker meeting houses was built on Upper Goat Lane in Norwich in 1679. That's the second slide. It was here that, aged 15, Fowell Buxton visited with the Gurneys, who were regular attenders. Another very strong presence in the city had been the remarkable Reverend William Enfield, who led the Unitarian congregation at the Octagon Chapel in Colgate. This is the chapel there on the right, the inside. Enfield had definite radical sympathies, but he was also an ecumenicist with a reputation for bringing those of different views into polite discussion, including Anglican and nonconformist clergy and physicians. And of note, he was often a dinner guest at the Bishop of Norwich, which says a lot about him and a lot about the city, I think, at the time. People were talking to each other and listening. In 1807, Fowell Buxton married his Quaker wife, Hannah Gurney, at the Friends' house in Taysborough, Norfolk. They had a very loving, supportive marriage. Tragically, they lost 4 of their children to diphtheria in 1820, which devastated the couple. 2 other children also died in childhood. Their deep sense of faith and the strength of their relationship enabled them to carry on. They had 5 surviving children and a very happy family life. Hannah Gurney and Thomas Fowell Buxton were the founding fathers of an extraordinary dynasty. Many are here today. Extraordinary in terms of sheer number and terms of impressive individual achievement. In 1808, Fowell Buxton joined his mother's family brewing company, Truman and Hanbury, in Spitalfields, Brick Lane in the East End of London. He proved himself an intelligent, industrious and capable man, turning around the company's fortunes. In 1811, he was made a partner and the company began known as Truman, Hanbury and Buxton. The business began to run itself and it gave him a more than adequate income for the rest of his life. I have heard the profits were gargantuan, but certainly more than adequate is a polite way of saying it. The brewery was right in the heart of the very deprived East End of London, and he was deeply affected by what he saw. First of all, Fowell Buxton set about improving the conditions of his employees, a day off on Sunday and reading lessons for the illiterate. So began his career as a social reformer. He worked on providing practical support for poor relief. He raised money for Whitechapel's London Hospital and he helped open adult schools. He also worked alongside of his sister-in-law, Elizabeth Fry, on areas of prison reform. This building is still in existence. I think they're trying to look and see what they can do with it. I know you could definitely still buy Truman's beer. So the company is going. In 1819, he became an MP when he was given the Dorset constituency of Weymouth. Why Weymouth? Why Weymouth? Well, if you can see, his grandparents, Isaac Buxton and Sarah Fowell, lived in Weymouth. And I think he often visited there as a child and mixed with royalty. I think he had a very well-connected Weymouth life. His mother also remarried and lived there. I don't believe he ever lived in Weymouth. He visited for constituency business only. This house here, Belfield House, he inherited in 1813, and he rented it to his uncle Charles Buxton. This is the house then. You can see it's got beautiful views of Dorset seaside and cliffs and beaches. This is the house now. It's still, it's a listed building. It's still just about standing up. It's still lived in as a family home with beautiful gardens and a conservatory at the back. It's completely surrounded by houses now, but the road, there's a Buxton Road just on the side of the, alongside the house there. Over the next few years, he slowly built a reputation as a champion for moral and social reform causes in the House of Commons, some of which I've alluded to. One man who noticed Fowell Buxton in Parliament was William Wilberforce, who on a fateful day in 1822 rode into North Norfolk by horse-drawn carriage to visit Fowell Buxton at his home, Cromer Hall. There were no trains then. It must have been a long, bumpy, dusty journey for Wilberforce, who was not in the best of health. He was tired, and it had taken him 4 attempts over 18 years to get the slave trade abolished. He knew he needed to hand over the helm to another person. After the 1807 Slave Trade Act, the British Navy attempted to police the seas and stop any British ship carrying slaves, but it was an impossible task, and they tried very hard. Piracy and smuggling were rampant. The lives of the already enslaved remained unchanged. In addition, Britain continued to acquire further slave colonies, including Demerara and Bernice in Guyana. I have heard it said that there were more slaves in the British Empire in 1833 than there were in 1807. I've heard it said. I haven't seen any figures. So William Wilberforce knew we had to do something else, and he chose Fowell Buxton to take over his leadership. During this stay, an important meeting was held, and Fowell Buxton did agree to take over heading the long-running campaign for the liberation of the slaves of the British dominions. Also present at this meeting was Lord Suffield of the nearby Gunton estate, and he was an important ally and advocate in the House of Lords. A year later, in 1823, the legendary Anti-Slavery Society was formed. Fowell Buxton was at the helm. There's still an anti-slavery society today in the world for obvious reasons. I think it's slightly changed from the original one, but certainly that was a very important event in 1823. One question I often get asked by lots of people is, what kind of man was Fowell Buxton? And I've thought long and hard about how to answer this, but I decided to answer it by comparing Wilberforce and Buxton. They were very similar in many ways, but they were also very different. They were very close personal friends. Physically, Wilberforce was a short man at 5'4", just about my height, who seemed to have had a twist in his spine. He walked very twisted, and he was known as the Shrimp. Fowell Buxton was 6'4", tall, athletic, well-built, and he was known as the Elephant. These are genuine names of the era. Wilberforce was a natural orator. He was a charming, witty man who apparently could hold an audience spellbound at parties and at Parliament. He used to give 3-hour speeches in Parliament, can you imagine? But they listened to him. James Boswell, the famous Scottish chronicler, made a really lovely comment about Wilberforce when he wrote that as Wilberforce started to speak, the shrimp grew and grew and turned into a whale. Fowell Buxton, however, was a very serious and an earnest man. The word gravitas comes to mind when I think about him. Clearly, the shrimp would walk into a room and light it up. Well, Fowell Buxton walked in, people stopped and respectfully listened. Fowell Buxton grew into his role as a public speaker. He wasn't a natural orator. His strength was his careful argument and his meticulous presentation of evidence, which took a lot of work. He studied hard. Both men had a deep religious faith. They were committed to social reform. They both had very strong marriages with a focus on family life, and both had sufficient private means to sit as independent MPs. What impresses me about them both is their sheer, dogged determination and their tenacity, without which these two acts may never have been passed. In America, they had to have a war to end slavery. In Britain and the colonies, we had Parliament. The vested interests of the establishment and the West Indian merchants were a powerful force to be reckoned with. They both often led isolated, lonely lives at Parliament, deeply unpopular for debating year after year on the evils of slavery. They fought against political skullduggery and character assassination that resulted in resolutions and bills repeatedly failing to pass through Parliament. I found these two quotes, which I think are really lovely. The elephant, with ordinary talent and extraordinary perseverance, all things are attainable. So very humble, he was a humble man. The shrimp, it is the true duty of every man to promote the happiness of his fellow creatures to the utmost of his power. I think it says it all, really. Right, the slave trade. It's a very complex, nuanced story, and I'm only really able to give a brief outline here today. Britain came late to the transatlantic slave trade in 1560, following in the footsteps of Portugal and Spain. But Britain soon came to dominate. With the strength of its navy, they dominated the seas. The slave trade certainly accelerated its industrial revolution. The British Empire at its heyday was the biggest and richest the world has ever seen. This map shows a triangular trade route, which was a sailing route taken by slave traders. It was a journey of 3 stages. Ships packed full of goods, cloth, guns, gunpowder, copper kettles, and brandy would set sail bound for West Africa. Most slave ships got their enslaved from British factors who lived full-time in Africa and bought and bartered enslaved people from local African chiefs. Local African chiefs raided villages in the interior. The enslaved were then marched in chained lines where they were held in fort-like prisons. Elmina Castle in current-day Ghana, formerly the Gold Coast, is the biggest and the oldest. My daughter went there on a school trip a few years ago, and she found it very harrowing and very moving. There's a door in the castle which the slaves went to, straight into the boats, and that was the door of no return. The slave ship then sailed across the Atlantic to the West Indies. This leg of the voyage was known as the Middle Passage, which is the green arrow here. On arrival, they were sold at auction for profit. Slaves were the workforce on plantations that produced the cash crops of tobacco, cotton, coffee, and sugar. They were shipped back across the Atlantic to the bustling ports of Bristol, Liverpool, London, and Glasgow to sell for further fantastic profit, gargantuan profit. Slavery was a chattel-based industry. Slaves were private property. The industry was held together by violence and brutality, and this is well documented. The slave ship of the Middle Passage was a floating prison, chained together below deck in cramped small spaces. Dysentery, disease, and suicide. The slaves just threw themselves over the side of the ship, were the main causes of the 10 to 20% death rate. This is something else I read, which I find very, very unpleasant. In the days before landing, to get them ready for market, the slaves were washed and scrubbed in palm oil to give their skin a healthy sheen, to look as if they were fit and well and sell for more money. Beatings, whippings, and sexual assault were rampant. Slaves were sold and moved on without warning from one property to another. Families were broken up at the whim of the slave master. Their names and languages were wiped out. The nature of the system was built so that there was no escape. Their progeny were all born slaves, and their progeny's progeny were all to be born slaves. I've got two slides here. The left is ankle chains, which David Livingstone found in Central Africa and brought back to Britain. And the second one is my trusty jackdaw leaflet, which is notice of a public auction. On Monday, the 18th of May, 1829, under the trees for sale, the three following slaves. Hannibal, about 30 years old, an excellent house servant of good character. William, about 35 years old, a labourer. Nancy, an excellent house servant and nurse. You can see they were all given Western names, and their language and their names were lost forever. This is another slide from my trusty jackdaw. An account of the number of Negroes delivered by the Royal African Company between 1698 and 1707, given to the Lords Commissioners of Trade by the said company. Now, the Royal African Company is very interesting and very brutal, actually. It was established in 1660 by the Duke of York, the future James II. His brother King Charles was also involved. The company, with its London merchants, had a monopoly on all trade with Africa until 1697. From 1680 to 1686, the company transported an average of 5,000 slaves per year, most of which were shipped to the colonies in the Caribbean and Virginia. Branding was used widely, but this I found very uncomfortable because this company used the branding iron with the letters DY, the Duke of York. The slaves were the personal property of our future king. In the 1770s, challenges to the widely held assumptions of the merits of slavery began, and this eventually became one of Britain's defining moral and political battles. The Quakers were the first in 1783 to form a formal anti-slavery committee, with the Norfolk branch forming in 1785, so just 2 years after. The Quakers saw the ownership of one human being by another contradicted their belief in the fundamental equality of all human beings. I think they call it the testimony to equality. It's a Quaker thing. Norwich and Norfolk played an important role in this 60-year campaign. The local press here in Norwich were very supportive. By now we've got the Norfolk Chronicle and the Norfolk Chronicle and the Norwich Gazette, it's called. In 1788, the Reverend Harrington of St. Peter Mancroft preached that slavery was incompatible with Christianity. In 1792, a petition was signed by over 2,000 Norwich citizens, stating the slave trade was a disgrace to a free, generous, and enlightened nation. Great Yarmouth, Swaffham, Harlesden, Wymondham, and Diss followed suit. These petitions, great piles of them in boxes, were then transported down to the Houses of Parliament. In Norwich, an amicable group of philanthropic ladies was formed, and women's groups were soon to become an integral part of the local abolitionist movement. Sugar boycotts were very well organised in Norfolk, mainly by women. Sorry, I'll have a sip of water. The powerful and aggressive campaign led by the Society of West Indian Planters, meanwhile, attempted an alternative version. A Barbados plantation owner wrote a letter to the Norfolk Chronicle in 1824, stating his slaves were well-fed, well-clothed, with access to medical care and plenty of wine. I find that hard to believe. After 1823 and the formation of the Anti-Slavery Society, Norwich's branch became amongst the most active, with the energetic leadership of Joseph John Gurney and support from Priscilla Buxton, who was Thomas Fowell Buxton's daughter, Anna Gurney, Amelia Opie, and Harriet Martineau. How was the campaign run? How did the anti-slavery message get into the homes of the British public? I've already mentioned petitions and sugar boycotts. So we have here, on the left-hand side, we've got, it was a children's poem, I believe, called The Black Man's Lament. It was long, this is only a page of it, by our very own Amelia Opie. It was very well read, and especially in the States. I can just read this. This is just one verse. From parents, brethren's fond embrace, from tender wife and child to tear, then in a darksome ship to place, packed close like bales of cotton there. Logos. This Josiah Wedgwood, who was a Quaker, designed this logo. It was originally a medallion, I believe, and then the logo was put onto jugs and teapots and cups and plates. Am I not a man and a brother? This became the campaign logo. Then we come to, this is a slave neck iron. And we have to mention another man here, Thomas Clarkson, who was a very famous man of the time, another unsung hero. He was enormously energetic. He rode up and down the breadth of the country giving talks. He had a treasure chest full of brutal weapons and things of torture which had come back from Africa and from the colonies. And he displayed them. There's a big chest, and this is one of the items that was there. There were tongue braces, there were thumb presses, there were whippings, there were cat o' nine tails. It was brutal, brutal, brutal. Right. So, in the 1830s, the British government realised they'd lost the moral argument. Wilberforce and Thomas Fowell Buxton had done their business. They were independent MPs. They were able to act independently. I think the party political system was not as tight as it was now. It was much looser, but certainly Fowell Buxton and Wilberforce did their bit. And in the 1830s, the British government knew they'd lost the battle. And then they had to look at how they were going to practically free the slaves. Above all, they were concerned not to crash the economy. Another huge stumbling block was the concept of the sanctity of private property, which I think goes back to the Magna Carta. Fowell Buxton was involved at very high level with these complex and fraught negotiations. So it came about. The British government borrowed 20 million to pay to the slave owners for the compensation for the loss of their private property. After the Reform Act of 1832, lots of rotten boroughs got rid of, and there were lots of new MPs, and the Act passed safely through on the 1st of August, 1830, what am I now? Confused now. 1833, or 1st of August, 1833. So the British government borrowed £20 million, which in today's date, I think is about 3 billion, over 3 billion. The slave owners had to put in a claim. They had to prove their own property. They had to prove their own slaves. So it was quite a long, drawn-out business. But in 2009, University College London digitalised the records. And anybody can look now. You go online and you can have great fun with it. You can Google, you can enter any parameter, county, date of birth, name, family name, first name, and I've had great fun looking at the Norfolk compensation claims. And the one that drew my notice was this one, Reverend Hines Howell from Drayton in Norfolk. He received compensation of £3,500, which was over £500,000, today's money, for the loss of 161 enslaved in Barbados. Slave ownership was everywhere. The biggest single claim was made by Ania Sparkley and Davidson, who were Scottish London-based sugar merchants. They got 164,000, 27 million, for the loss of over, I think it's about 4,500 enslaved people. Slaves were in 27 plantations in Antigua, British Guiana, Grenada, Jamaica, St. Vincent and Trinidad. Ania Sparkley was my 4 times great-grandfather. He was the youngest of 5 sons of a merchant of Cromarty at the tip of the Black Isle in the Highlands of Scotland. After the Union Act of 1707, the Scots embraced empire. They embraced the British colonies. All the second sons, third sons, fourth sons, fifth sons left Scotland to seek their fortunes. And my 4 times great-grandfather was such a one. He left Scotland. He was the son of his father was a local merchant, and he certainly made his fortune. What happened to the 27 million? Well, that might be another talk. I certainly have any of it. Another astonishing fact, that the British government only paid off the debt in 2015. Fowell Buxton, oh, sorry, oh, where are we now? Fowell Buxton, oh, no, oh yeah, so, hold on, yeah, so, this slide. So, you may have heard of the reparations. The word reparations is talked about a lot at the moment. The enslaved received nothing, not a penny. And this is only one of the areas which are part of a very broad movement for claims for reparations from the former slave colonies. My story ends on the 1st of August, 1834, but believe you me, nothing was straightforward from then on, and the struggle continues today. Fowell Buxton was to live another 12 years. He died at his home, Northreps Hall, aged 57 in 1845. He had made Norfolk his home for most of his life. He found a peace in the Norfolk countryside, and it provided him with respite from his exhausting Westminster life. He was surrounded by people who loved and supported him, a large, loving family, friends, neighbours, devoted employees and political allies. He was buried in St. Martin's Church, Overstrand, near Cromer. I've just read this lovely quote from the day. On the day of his funeral, people came through lanes and across fields from every direction to lie in the streets. This is Northreps Hall, where he died. This is the church, and this is the plaque inside the church. I can tell you there are hundreds of Buxtons in that church and hundreds of Buxtons outside. They're everywhere. But they're lovely. They're very lovely. After he died, Prince Albert set up a public fund to erect a monument, a statue in Westminster Abbey. And which is another extraordinary fact, is £450 was contributed by former enslaved, and it cost £1,500 in total. It's a beautiful statue, dignified and understated, like Fowell Buxton himself. So here we are. This is the legacy of Thomas Fowell Buxton. He's recognised at home and all over the world. This is a £5 note. We've got 2 people on this £5 note from Norfolk. We've got Thomas Fowell Buxton, who's in the left, the tall man, 6'4", and that's Elizabeth Fry. The engraving is based on Jerry Barrett's painting, Mrs. Fry reading to the prisoners in Newgate in the year 1816. Then we have the Michael University Teacher Training College, which Thomas Fowell Buxton helped fund and help establish. It's a very prestigious college. I think it's the first teaching training college in that part of the world. And this is Buxton House. The third slide is taken from St. George's Cathedral in Freetown in Sierra Leone. There's a very famous Buxton village in Guyana. And I heard about this Buxton village on Monday night. I was at a meeting at the Reform Club in Pall Mall. They've just opened an exhibition about Thomas Fowell Buxton. And Sir Trevor Phillips opened it, and he's from Guyana. And he told the story of how in 1840, freed slaves managed to get enough money to buy some land and a village in Guyana, and they called it Buxton. Not only that, Trevor said that the word Buxton and the people of Buxton are always known for being forthright and very out there. I think that's the word he used. So he was very clear that Thomas Fowell Buxton is very well known about in Guyana. Now, Guyana is interesting because the reason why my ancestor got so much money, because at the time in 1833, the most profitable sugar plantations were in Guyana, and the funding was based on the profitability of the plantation. Another famous Guyana man we will have heard of is William Gladstone. John Gladstone owned 2,500 slaves. And I think he got the second largest compensation of 105,000. So Guyana is very, very interesting. And they are very much part of the, called the CARICOM movement, which is a movement of former slave colonies that are looking to seek reparations. I had the honour of meeting some of them in London last month. So we've got 10 years, folks, 10 years to plan. 2034, the bicentenary of the Emancipation Act, plenty of time to plan. We must make Fowell Buxton and his legacy better known locally and nationally, I think. I must thank the very active and forward-thinking Thomas Fowell Buxton Society. They've been very supportive. They're based in Weymouth. They want to open a branch here. Their campaigning efforts led to the construction of a magnificent monument to Fowell Buxton. It's beautiful, looks over the White Cliffs, absolutely beautiful. And next to it is a plaque, an information board, and an epitaph that reads, "His sympathy was awakened by men he had never seen, and he gave the best years of his life to their welfare." Thank you.